Another key difference in a Charlotte Mason education is narrating or narration. Narration is the act of retelling in one's own words what has been read or heard. It requires the child to process, organize, and reproduce knowledge, which promotes deep understanding. Narration is both a learning tool and a communication skill, emphasizing that it teaches children to think critically and express ideas clearly. So here's what narration is not. It is not just merely memorizing some facts. It involves understanding and processing ideas and not just recalling facts. So it's also not just for younger kids. As your child progresses into their high school years, they are still narrating. Narrating is something that you will do after every reading that you do in a Charlotte Mason curriculum. So it is valuable for learners of all age, and it can grow in complexity. So it's not about perfection. It's not about giving every single detail. It is just about what stands out to the child. So as you begin narrating, it may be a little rough, it may be incomplete, but the goal is growth over time. So this is it's a long game approach for sure. So here's what narration does do. It strengthens attention. A child must pay close attention to the material in order to narrate it well. Charlotte says the child must not be allowed to dawdle over a book. He should know that he must single out what he wants to know and carry it away at the time of reading or hearing. Only one reading should be allowed. So you read the passage that is on your plan for the day, you read it one time, and then your student tells back what they heard and what they remember. Narration promotes active learning. Instead of passively receiving information, narration engages the child in actively working with the material. It also encourages retention. The process of retelling helps children to internalize what they've learned, making it more memorable. It also develops critical thinking. So, in order to narrate effectively, a child must select key details, make connections, and present them coherently. It also fosters communication skills. So, regular narration builds confidence in organizing thoughts and expressing them, which is a foundational skill for writing and for speaking. So, when you start narrating, if you can, start your children when they are very young with oral narration. So, if your children are a little bit older, that's okay. You can still begin with oral narrations, and you may start with short passages or short stories, and then you just have them tell back what they have heard or what they remember. When you're doing this, make sure to be patient because narrating is a skill and it takes time to develop any skill. So, again, you're going to start with small, simple readings and then have them tell back. And as you do that, your ability and their ability to narrate will grow with practice. So, what I have shared with you on narrating is the very basics of narrating. I have two additional resources for you to help you kind of grow and understanding what narration is a little bit more. So, the first thing is I have an interview with an amazing lady. Her name is Karen Glass. So, Karen Glass was a Charlotte Mason home educator. She's graduated all her children, they're all adults now. So, she homeschooled them using Charlotte Mason's principles all through their education. So, she has a lot of wisdom when it comes to homeschooling and specifically with narration. She's also one of the founding members of Ambleside Online, which is a prominent Charlotte Mason curriculum. She was one of the writers for that. And then she also is an author. She wrote this book called Know and Tell. And this book is a deep dive into all things narration. It talks about how to start, oral narrations and then transitioning into written narrations and some things that you may observe or some challenges that you may have along the way. And so I highly recommend that you get your hands on a copy of this book, Know and Tell. Like, honestly, you couldn't be an effective Charlotte Mason home educator if you don't read Karen Glass's book. You have to get it. So I'll put a link for you to grab a copy of this book, but also watch this video from Karen Glass as she shares more on narration. So speaking of narration, I think a lot of people are introduced to you potentially through your books that you've written on narration. But kind of where did that desire and just the passion to really talk about that, like where did that come from?
Well, I share this story in Know and Tell about, I just told you I started reading Charlotte Mason when my son was three and a half, but we didn't start narration until he was 6. I did follow that recommendation, that Charlotte Mason gave. So then he was 6 and we started doing narration. About 2 months after we'd been doing it. It was only November rather, of our first school year. He's 6. We read a book about the first Thanksgiving. It's Alice Dalglish's The First Thanksgiving, the story of the first Thanksgiving, I think it's called. Very age appropriate Thanksgiving book. We took about a week to read it. He narrated every chapter, and it was just part of what we were doing in November of that first year that we were homeschooling. And a friend called me one day, and her son was a year older. He was using a box curriculum, and she was really frustrated because he'd had a writing assignment. Second grade, he'd had a writing assignment where he was supposed to write 2 sentences about the first Thanksgiving, and he wrote, "The Pilgrims are nice, the Indians are nice." That's what he wrote, and she just wasn't very impressed with his writing assignment. And I just commiserated with her. It, and then I got off the phone, and I thought, hmm. And I went to my son. We'd already done that reading and narrating. And I just said to him, "What can you tell me about the first Thanksgiving?" Didn't say 2 sentences. I just said, "What can you tell me about the first Thanksgiving?" And he narrated the whole story. We'd read that book and he narrated it, and he told me the whole story, and he used the correct names and included lots and lots of details. And if I had transcribed what he wrote, it probably would have filled a page and a half. But I knew he couldn't write a page and a half. In fact, he couldn't have written "The Pilgrims are nice, the Indians are nice." And I saw what a difference narration made, because it allowed a child who could think and articulate to reproduce and share what they know without being hindered by their ability to write and spell on paper. And I just thought, if it makes that big of a difference, I remember thinking this, if it makes that big of a difference now when he's 6, I want to see what will happen if we carry this through all the years that we're doing school. And so this is about 1996. I didn't know anybody who had done that. Charlotte Mason wasn't being used with anybody at the high school level at that point. I had a few friends who had maybe young teenagers, and there was no curriculum that they could use with their high schoolers. It was hard enough to find curriculum at all for high school at that stage. The idea of a Charlotte Mason narration-based curriculum was not even in anyone's thoughts. And so I didn't know anybody who'd done that, but I just thought, if it makes such a difference, I want to see what will happen if we follow it all the way through. And so when my son was 6, I committed us to doing that. Wow. And then, of course, a few years later, I was working with some other people, and we developed what would become the Ambleside online curriculum. And of course, some of the ladies who were working on that were the real pioneers who were doing Charlotte Mason with their high schoolers. But because I had that early connection, like narration really matters, like this is going to make a difference, I was always paying attention to what people said about narration, like what they were doing, if they shared sample narrations. And so from the very beginning, even though I was just starting out, my attention was on narration. I remember thinking when my son was 10, and so at 10, we were just still in the beginning stages of written narration with him. But I remember thinking, you could write a whole book about narration. Like there could be a whole book about this, just this one thing. And of course, it was many, many years before I'd be in a position to write a book like that. But when I did come to, after I'd graduated 3 high schoolers, to write the book on narration, I didn't just have the experience of my own kids and their homeschool, but I had been paying attention. And I sort of, because of Ambleside Online, I'd had a front row seat watching other people and what they were doing with narration and seeing. And so I've heard, interestingly, the same stories. I've heard the same stories from parents who use narration with their children. And so after a while, you can just see the patterns. You can see this is normal, this is typical, this is what narration will do for your child. And so I've been able to extrapolate principles that I now feel very confident in saying things about narration that I wouldn't have even felt confident saying in 2018 when I wrote No One Tell. Like I'm even more like focused on narration and what it does. So just for example, one of the things that I feel is you can say almost unequivocally, narration is a relationship building process. That's one of the things that I do say in that book. But now I feel even more confident in saying that narration helps to build relationships between your child and a book, even if they hate narrating it. Even if you think narration is ruining your child's relationship with the book, it's not. It's ruining your experience. Not gonna sugarcoat that. It's ruining your experience while your child is processing this book. But 2 years from now, your child will remember the book, the relationship happened, the relationship was formed, and they will not remember how miserable they were while they narrated their way through it. You will, sorry, but they won't. That doesn't stick with them, but the relationship is formed in spite of their antipathy about narrating.
Wow, that is really so good. And you actually taught a college class like recently on
Yes.
narration, is that correct?
Yes, I did. And it forced me because my own personal experience has mostly been in homeschooling. I was a homeschooler. Um, it's forced me to think about narration in group and classroom contexts quite a bit more.
Yeah, that's really awesome. So, um, I was trying to think of, I had another question I wanted to ask you, but I lost it. But you feel like the biggest thing with narration is that, especially in the younger years, that it's a non-negotiable. Like we have
Right.
to make sure that we're implementing and creating that habit of narrating, whether it's painful or not.
Right. And that's because consistency is what will bring the benefits that narration has. And
Yeah.
it isn't just a foundation for composition and writing, although it does lead into that. It is also training them how to think in a
Mhm.
particular way. And this is something that you don't necessarily think about, the fact that your educational practices are training you to think in a certain way, but they are. And if you grew up as I did, and many of us probably did, in an institutional school setting where your experience with learning was always focused on being able to answer questions that asked for particular details so that you had to recall a lot of information, it's literally teaching you to what a lot of times, I mean, we were told to do it. Read the questions at the end first, and then read the book, the chapter. So you're just looking, you know what they want, and you're just looking for that information. So it's teaching you to skim, it's teaching you, um, it's letting somebody else decide which pieces of information are the most important. And because you deal with every single one of them in isolation, it's just it fragments everything.
Mm.
that particular kind of um, mental exercise on a day-to-day basis creates this very, very fragmented relationship or approach to knowledge. The very first thing you do when you approach something is break it down. I mean, they tell you to do it, break it all down, into small pieces, which causes you to think in a certain way, and you just approach everything. Whereas you can't really have a relationship with a whole bunch of little pieces. You
Mm.
have to have a sense of the wholeness. There has to be, in order for a relationship to form, there has to be some kind of, whole thing that you can identify and understand and relate to. And yeah, you may not understand all the parts of it, but that's the entrance. If you're going to have a relationship, has to happen by appreciating the whole thing. And so it's why in a Charlotte Mason education, we read real books. And Charlotte Mason always says, read an episode before you ask for narration, because it's hard to narrate little pieces. Whereas
Mm.
if there's an episode, there's a whole thing, and you can, you may not be able to remember every detail, but you get a sense of the whole. And that kind of thinking that's always looking for the whole, pulling the pieces together to create an understanding of a whole thing just creates an entirely different kind of thinking process. And the better you understand it for yourself. And most of us have to redeem our education. We have to remediate that kind of fragmented thinking that we had. And so the further we get in the process, I personally consider that my real education began when I started homeschooling my kids. Everything that came before, all the years of institutional school, including my degree and diploma, I don't even count that as
Mm.
education, because the only thing I ever learned how to do or learned in that education was how to take tests. That's
Mm.
what I learned. I learned how to take tests, and I was really good at it. And I can take any test, that you want to offer. But that's it. That is all I learned how to do, was take tests and think that way. And
Mm.
so Charlotte Mason education is a paradigm shift, or it's a whole series of paradigm shifts.
Yeah.
But every time, you come closer to aligning yourself to what she's saying about education, you are, in a sense, healing your own thinking and your understanding. The way that you think is, closer to. And there is one thing that I think um, can be a sort of antidote to that kind of institutional schooling, is if you had really good Bible teaching, because the Bible is presents everything in this very integrated and related way. Unfortunately, you can have fragmented Bible teaching too, and Bible teaching can be all torn apart into little pieces as well. But if you had good Bible teaching, I feel like that in some ways counteracts the fragmented teaching, because it also teaches you to, or the Bible, everything is approached through that wholeness and related, and everything is connected to everything else. And so if you were fortunate enough to grow up in a good church with that kind of good Bible teaching, it can help to counteract this too. But if not, in the meantime, it's not too late. Here we are. And I think like I said, my education started when I started homeschooling my
Yeah.
children. And so we still have time to, uh, we still have time to correct it and to join our children in having this kind of healthier way of thinking and approaching knowledge.
Yeah.
No matter what, narration is non-negotiable. No matter how hard it is, and no matter how much your kids hate it. And um, it's one of the most important things you can do in a Charlotte Mason education, but it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be, you know, 100% thorough, complete narrations every lesson, every day, 5 days a week. I tend to think of it, Charlotte Mason talks about narration is your child's digestion of the lessons that they've learned. But, there are certain days out of the year that you probably make like really, really special food. Like you have a fancy breakfast, on Mother's Day, or Easter brunch, or of course Thanksgiving dinner. There's days where you go all out and you have, extra recipes and everything, all the parts, you have the dessert, and you have, special drinks, and just everything is great, but you can't sustain that kind of cooking unless you're a professional chef and getting paid for it 365 days a year. Most every day you're thinking, what's quick, what's easy, one pot meals, you're on rotation, it's spaghetti night, it's taco night, and your family's nourished and they're fed. And that's the way you need to think about narration for your kids. Don't expect every narration that they give you to be the equivalent of Thanksgiving dinner. Be okay, with the peanut butter and jelly narration, where they just give you a sentence or two and they're not doing a great job. The habit of doing it is part of what makes narration such an effective technique in the Charlotte Mason. It's such an effective method. And also, what they actually say to you is not the full measure of everything that happened in their mind. And you can't see that. But just like digestion, it's the part that really matters. So you just have to, just like you keep feeding your kids, you have to, and trusting, okay, well, we know they're growing because the notch on the door, the mark on the door is a little higher this year, and I had to get new shoes because they outgrew those. And the signs are there that your child is growing, but it takes time. And so the most important thing, just like getting meals in every day, even if they're not fancy, is that your kids narrate every day, even if it's kind of mundane. That's what I would tell my younger self. Don't give up narrating.